Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Jerusalem Fund and our educational program, the Palestine Center. My name is Zaina Azam. I'm the executive director here, and I'm delighted to see all of you. And welcome also to our online audience, our live stream audience. Tonight we have two special guests with us who will be talking about a very timely and very important topic, BDS, or Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, which is a global grassroots movement that was initiated by Palestinian civil society in 2005. It calls for the academic, consumer, and cultural boycott of Israeli institutions, companies, goods, and services as a means to draw public attention to the facts of Israeli oppression and military occupation of Palestinian lives and land, and ultimately to pressure Israel to comply with international law. Our speakers will focus on the historical, comparative, and theoretical context of BDS, addressing how and why the movement developed, how other movements have deployed it to challenge institutional discrimination, and why it is such a powerful tool. They will also cover past and current legislative efforts to suppress and punish BDS activism in the United States. So let me introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker will be Omar Shakir, who is a Bertha Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights. His work includes representation of Guantanamo detainees, Muslim community members affected by NYPD surveillance, and the famous case of Professor Stephen Saleta, his civil rights lawsuit against the University of Illinois. Omar has researched and co-authored the Palestine Exception to Free Speech, which is this amazing compilation of information from campuses and other places. And this is a Center for Constitutional Rights and Palestine Legal report. Another report called All According to Plan, a 2014 Human Rights Watch report focused on the Rabaa massacre in Egypt. And Living Under Drones, which is a 2012 Stanford NYU law report. Omar is a former Fulbright scholar in Syria and holds a JD from Stanford Law School, an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where I met him a long time ago, and a BA in International Relations from Stanford. So welcome, Omar. I'll go ahead and introduce our second speaker as well, and then we'll start. Rahul Saksena is a staff attorney with Palestine Legal, which is a nonprofit dedicated to protecting the civil and constitutional rights of people in the United States who speak out for Palestinian freedom. His work focuses on legislative issues, advocacy for activists whose rights are under attack, and building Palestine Legal's network of legal and other advocates. Previously, Rahul Saksena was the legislative director for a member of the New York City Council, where he focused on police accountability and tenants and workers' rights. He has served as policy director for the Restaurant Opportunities Center of New York and as legislative counsel for the New York Civil Liberties Union. He holds a JD from the Washington College of Law at American University and a BA in Political Science and History from the University of Michigan. So as you can see, we have two very special, extremely knowledgeable, informed, experienced, and activist speakers here with us today, one from New York and one from Chicago, and we're just so delighted that both of you accepted our invitation to come all the way and talk to our audience. I've asked Omar and Rahul to speak for 20 minutes each, after which we'll open the floor for discussion and questions. So, Omar, if you'd like to speak, start. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's a real honor to be back at the Palestine Center, and thank you, Zina and Samira, for all your incredible work here at the center and for organizing this event on such a really important and timely topic. It's also an honor to speak with my colleague Rahul, who, as you'll hear, has really led the Herculean effort to respond to the wave of anti-BDS legislation that's cropped up over the last couple of years. So it's an honor to speak with you as well. Just to give you a little bit of an overview, in my 20 minutes, what I hope to do is to talk about the context part of the title, and specifically looking historically, comparatively, and theoretically at why boycott, divestment, sanctions is such an effective tool. And that'll sort of provide the backdrop to Rahul's comments around the challenges facing the movement and sort of the reason why I think we see increasing efforts to suppress BDS. And I thank Rahul for taking the pessimistic or the challenges side and the more legal side, allowing me to be a little bit more theoretical in my comments. I will draw on several historical examples, but one that I'll draw from significantly is South Africa, as I was just in South Africa last month and have done a lot of thinking around BDS in that context. I'm going to make three pretty simple points, and then I'll hand it over. And all of those points, I think, underscore why BDS is such an effective tool. And those points are, first, it helps reframe the conversation. Secondly, it changes the calculus of Israeli activists. And third, it mobilizes communities in the international community. So I'm going to go through those 3 points, and then I'll hand it over to Rahul. So the first point really is that boycott, divestment, and sanctions changes the framework. And what do I mean by that? What I mean about that is, in the U.S. context, one of the most significant challenges we face is the perception that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is this 1,000-year-old conflict, right? It goes back to the beginning of time. It's about these people that hate each other, religion, ethnicity. It can never be resolved. It's communal hatred at its core. As the logic goes, there's two equal sides, right? There's two narratives or powers, and states or powers that are equally culpable. Or in fact, if they're not equally culpable, the Palestinians are more responsible because they're the violent terrorist type. And that logic goes further, right? And it says that each side has its legitimate blind spots. It has claims, and that it's only misunderstanding and hatred. And if only the people could come together and dialogue and compromise and listen to the other, then we could have reconciliation and we could have coexistence. Right? Of course, we know that this narrative is simply false for a lot of reasons, right? We know that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, for the most part, a modern struggle that probably dates back, by most historical accounts, to the late 19th century over land, resources, and rights. And it's not so different than other post-colonial conflicts that we've seen. And we also know that a simplistic account of two sides overlooks the power dynamic, overlooks the fact that we face a situation of a colonizer and a colonized, an oppressor and oppressed, and we have a single power, right? A single power between the river and the sea that controls the everyday lives of the people that live there. So why is boycott, divestment, and sanctions so effective? It's effective because it focuses and it shifts attention to the underlying system, right? It looks at policies and institutions as opposed to tackling a particular state or individuals. It looks at a system of inequality, a system that includes corporations, international corporations, American corporations, Israeli corporations, and even Palestinian corporations in some case. And by doing so, right, it really puts that attention on that unjust system and not on the role of any particular side. So as an international community, when you take on boycott, divestment, and sanctions, what you're essentially doing is saying, look, I'm not Israeli, I'm not Palestinian, right? What I'm doing, though, is saying that I don't have a role to discuss a solution. It's not my job to tell you one state, two state, 14 states. What I can tell you is I'm a part of a church or a university or an academic union, and in that context, I do not want my institution invested in profiting over a system of discrimination and rights abuses. It really takes what's a very distant, far-removed issue and puts it in the terrain of your own specific context. And by doing that, you basically are able to say, look, let the people on the ground, when they're in equality, decide a solution. My job is to try and level that playing field by having that institution I'm affiliated with not actively supporting one side of the conflict. So it puts emphasis on the underlying rights abuse, but it does so using a language and a framework that's universal and inclusive. What it basically says is it's not about me being Palestinian or you being Israeli. It's about ending an unjust system so we can live together as equals. And again, that's not talking about one state, two states. It's talking about what the root injustice is. And this is all happening at the same time that the Palestinian narrative itself is shifting. Right? We see the Palestinian narrative moving more and more from a nationalist framework to a more rights-based discourse. So what do I mean by that? I think Ali Abu Netma, in his book One Country, I think has a very powerful anecdote that I think speaks to what's happening in Palestine. In his book, he talks about a 2004 encounter in which a farmer from the Palestinian town of Qalqilia is interviewed. He was displaced by Israel's wall in the West Bank. And in this conversation he has with a PLO legal advisor, he says the following, and I quote, "I don't care anymore about the Palestinian flag. I don't care anymore about the word Palestine. I don't care anymore about symbols. I just want to have the same rights as those settlers across the street. I want to be able to drive down this road. I want to be able to send my kids to the hospital or go on vacation when I want to go on vacation." Ali Abu Netma, reflecting on this incident, writes in his book, and I quote, "Palestinian message and methods must make clear that the target is not the Israeli system, but an unjust system that it's not the Israeli people, but an unjust system that denies one people their rights, identity, and dignity, and condemns the other to live in increasing isolation, fear, and moral corruption." Right? So I think increasingly the Palestinian movement, and it's learning from the international context. If you want to look at the world today, I think you can compare struggles like the Kurdish conflict or the Chechenian conflict or the Kashmiri conflict, ones that have remained nationalist in framework, right, about fundamentally self-determination, with those, say, like South Africa or Sudan, which were framed in a universal language, whether it be apartheid or genocide, one that allowed movements to build around. And what we see when we look at Palestinian activists, from hunger strikes by prisoners to bus boycotts, we see a new language who takes their target as the international community, as opposed to historically the Arab world, where the Arab world was seen as the primary actor that was going to bring Palestinian liberation. And I think BDS has succeeded in conjunction with the shift in the Palestinian narrative. And what's an example of this? I think for many of us that went to university in the early 2000s, the framework we dealt with was, well, there's occupation, but there's suicide bombing. It was sort of this two sides, what do I do? Today, if you talk to most college students, that's not the framework. The framework is Gaza attacks, we know Israel's committing abuse, what do we do about it? And that shift, I think, has a lot to do with BDS. So point one is it changes frameworks. The second point I want to make is it changes the calculus of Israel and Israeli politicians. Of course, the purpose of BDS, right? I mean, the reason why you engage in boycott, divestment, sanctions is to put pressure on the stronger party, right? It is the most effective, moral, non-violent way of exerting a pressure on the stronger power to come to the table and end the policies and rights abuses. And so you want to force them to make that change, right? And it grows out of a history. The history shows us that colonial regimes do not relinquish power without popular struggle and resistance, without sustained international pressure. So of course, that framework exists. People see it, whether it be looking at Algeria, whether it be looking at South Africa, but people always say, well, Israel's different, right? I mean, Israel won't change its policies. When you boycott, when you do BDS, what it does to Israel is it makes it double down. It makes them want to engage further in the occupation. But I think the reality is different. If you look today what's happening within the Jewish American movement, or even the movement within Israel, you see strong divides over the issue of Israel, right? You see groups like J Street and Jewish Voice for Peace that are basically telling Israeli officials, even those within the Zionist tent, saying that if you want to preserve Israel as a Jewish democratic state, you need to make progress on the occupation. Because they've learned from history that the longer Israel goes down this road, then the more it threatens a South African model. So what I wanted to do here is to look a little bit at the South African experience, because I think an understudied part of the Israel-South Africa comparison is the way in which the white Afrikaner population in South Africa, the Boer population, came itself to change its own calculus, and what led F.W. de Klerk, the last president of apartheid South Africa, to ultimately win that Nobel Prize with Nelson Mandela. That's sort of an understudied part of this example. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about that shift that happened in South Africa, because I think it's very instructive and points to why BDS is successful. But before I do that, just a little bit about South Africa, and a little bit about Afrikaners. So Afrikaner, it's a term that refers to the white South African population that came in the 17th century that are of Dutch origin. And the Afrikaner narrative is similarly like the Zionist narrative, one that's a narrative of expulsion, persecution, redemption, and rebirth that characterize their struggle. Their narrative starts with a single day in history, April 6th, 1652, when they set up on the Cape of Good Hope a colony. Mandela wrote in his book that this is the day white South Africans commemorate the founding of their country, and Africans revile as the beginning of 300 years of enslavement. So a similar type of thing as the Nakba. And if you look back at 19th and 20th century South African history, the Boer population languished actually under British colonialism. Actually, the term concentration camp was first used to refer to what the British put the white South Africans in the early 20th century. They initiated a scorched earth policy that destroyed tens of thousands of white South African homes, set up concentration camps, and tens of thousands were killed. This event is at the heart of the white South African narrative. F.W. de Klerk actually once declared, and I quote, "The Anglo-Boer War burnt itself in the collective consciousness of my people, the Afrikaners, like no other event in history." Actually, this history is what made the white South African population determined never again to forego their independence. Not so different than Zionism, their narrative was we need to control a state and be in power, or else we risk being subsumed by forces that dislike us. So in 1948, the nationalists came to power on a platform of formally erecting apartheid in power. And I quote from the Nationalist Party platform from 1948, quote, "The choice between us is one of two divergent courses, either that of integration, which in the long run would amount to national suicide on the part of whites, or that of apartheid, which professes to preserve the identity and safeguard the future of every race." Don Kraus, who's the chairman of the Johannesburg Holocaust Survivors Association, wrote, quote, "What the nationalists were trying to do was protect the Afrikaner, especially after what was done to them in the Boer War, where the Afrikaner was reduced almost to a beggar on returning after the war, whether it was on the battlefield or some sort of concentration camp. They did it to protect the Afrikaner, his predominance after 1948, his culture." Right? I mean, if you replace those terms with Zionist, it's a very similar logic to what's led to the creation of State of Israel and the maintenance of the occupation. Another parallel that people lose between Zionism and Afrikaner nationalism is the role of religion. Mandela once wrote, talking about the Afrikaners, I quote, "Like the Israeli journey to the Promised Land, his was the fulfillment of God's promise and the justification for their view that South Africa should be a white man's country forever." In fact, the Afrikaners compared their flight to the Israeli exodus from Egypt and saw their own republic as a new Israel. In addition, the white South African population reversed the indigenous relationship, right? They thought of themselves as the indigenous people. And they saw themselves as in a tough neighborhood, right, surrounded by uncivilized people. In 1976, South Africa put out a publication. This is a quote from that publication. Apartheid South Africa. "Israel and South Africa have one thing above all else in common. Quote, they're both situated in a predominantly hostile world inhabited by dark people." They used colonial logic and racism. They saw the people around them as inferior. They also had contradictions, right? They were a democracy in a sea of autocracy. They had technology. They sought to hide their encounters with their indigenous population. They actually depict their history, including 1948, as a fight for independence. And when you have that history, the only option you have is to erase the existence of the indigenous population. Of course, everybody remembers Moshe Dayan's famous quote in 1969, reflecting on 20 years of Israel, that the success was replacing old Palestinian villages with the names of Israeli villages. Well, I submit to you a quote from Mandela's autobiography, and he wrote in 1955 about driving in Durban, and this is a quote from his book. Quote, "From Durban I drove along the coast past Port Shepstone and Port St. John's, small and lovely colonial towns that dotted the simmering beaches fronting the Indian Ocean. While mesmerized by the beauty of the area, I was constantly rebucked by the buildings and streets that bear the names of white imperialists who suppress the very people whose names belong there." And of course, the last similarity that people forget is they're both obsessed about demographics. De Klerk once wrote that foremost among these was our conviction that without apartheid, our people would be swamped by the vast black majority, and that this would inevitably lead to the extinction of our hard-won right to self-determination. So you're probably asking me, Omar, you spent 3 minutes talking about South African history. What does that have to do with BDS? Well, South African officials have some advice for Israelis, actually. Piek Botha, the former South African foreign minister, was asked what advice he would give Israelis about dealing with this struggle. And I quote, "We could explain how we overcame our fear of majority rule and began to realize that majority rule was something in our interest in our long run. If the Israelis are interested, we can, in all humility, explain how we came to the point of transforming our society." BDS, in the South African context, provided the bridge that allowed the Afrikaner population to go from this narrative of victimization, of persecution, of not being able to forego apartheid, which was necessary to protect their national identity, to living in a system of equality because of BDS. How do I know that? F.W. de Klerk again writes, quote, we realized the struggle could not be won by brutal, unconventional operations which were in conflict with common decency and basic morality. No evidence that the assassination of opponents had the slightest effect on the final outcome of the struggle, other than causing further personal suffering and bitterness. De Klerk writes about the moment of watching Mandela take the oath of office. And he writes about this moment. He reflected on his ancestors, his Afrikaner ancestors, and he writes, "The dream they had of being free and separate people with their own right to national self-determination in their own national state in Southern Africa. The ideal to which I myself had clung until I finally concluded that if pursued would bring disaster to all people of our country, including my own." BDS led de Klerk to realize that the best way to preserve the place of Afrikaners in the future of South Africa was to open itself up to a society of equality. That realization saved lives, and it brought in the Nobel Peace Prize. Everybody wants to know, when will the Palestinian Mandela emerge? My question is, when will the Israeli de Klerk emerge? And I think we will see one, and it's because of BDS efforts. So I want to end with my third point, which is BDS also mobilizes people and movements. Hugh Evans, who was an Australian humanitarian, talked about BDS in the following terms. Quote, "History shows us that all protest movements rely on symbols, boycotts, strikes, sit-ins, flags, songs, symbolic action on whatever scale, from the Montgomery bus boycott to wearing a simple wristband. It's designed to disrupt our everyday complacency and force people to think." Right? So the idea is you move out of your everyday and you actually make this conflict, these sets of human rights abuses, something that's a real issue on your campus, in your union. You're debating and you're discussing it because you have a direct affiliation to it. And that mobilizes people, right? I mean, if you look at South Africa, Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop and Nobel Peace Laureate, said, and I quote, "In South Africa, we could not have achieved our freedom and just peace without the help of people around the world, who through the use of nonviolent means, such as boycott and divestment, encouraged their governments and other corporate actors to reverse decades-long support for the apartheid regime." And we're seeing this again in North Carolina and Mississippi in the wave of anti-LGBTQI legislation in place around bathrooms, right? We're seeing Bruce Springsteen and all sorts of leaders, boycott. And although that's symbolic, although not having a show does little to stop, to change a bathroom bill, the reality is the accumulation of that pressure together it mobilizes people, supports the movement, and forces leaders to change their calculus. And I'll conclude by saying we're starting to see that in Palestine. If we look at the history for the last decade, again, we used to be stuck in this rut in the early 2000s, post 9/11, after the Intifada in this country, of not being able to advance the conversation. Palestine was a fringe movement on many campuses. Those that worked on this issue could not build coalitions. We could not get co-sponsorship of major departments. That's all shifting, right? We see increasingly diverse groups, all following the call of Palestinian civil society in 2005, 171 NGOs calling for divestment. Today, we see the American Studies Association, other very prominent academic institutions endorsing boycott and divestment. We see student governments across the country, right? I mean, I did my university, as you heard, my studies at Stanford. You heard in my introduction. Stanford has a $21.4 billion endowment. last year the student government, in the face of widespread opposition, endorsed a call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And we're starting to see that take real effects. We have companies like Veolia, like G4S, like SodaStream that are shifting their operations as a result of the pressure they're facing from boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So you're going to hear from Rahul about the rise of anti-BDS legislation. But I want to make this point, and this is really what I'll conclude on, is to say that the reason why increasingly we're seeing Israel advocacy organizations move to anti-BDS legislation is because they're losing on the merits. They're losing the debate on college campuses. They're even losing on their other suppression tactics. In our report that was mentioned, we talk about things like legal threats and lawsuits and academic freedom actions. But they're losing on all fronts. Courts are rejecting their argument. Administrators are refusing to more and more to discipline students. So what are these groups doing as a last-ditch effort over the last year? They've raised money and said, we do one thing well. We lobby legislators. So let's turn to those very legislators and try to have them stop it because nothing else is working. But that's failing. So I want to end with a quote. And then I'll give it to Rahul. And the quote is a piece of hope, because you're going to hear some things that might make you pessimistic from him. So I want to leave you with some hope. No? Okay. Well, in any case, I'm still going to leave you with some hope. Israeli human rights lawyer Michael Safard had an op-ed in Haaretz 2 months ago, and he was addressing the question of how it is that civil society organizations, he was talking about the crackdown within Israel and Palestine, but it's really universal. How is it that they continue to make progress in spite of significant repression? And I'm just going to read his quote, and I'll sit down. Quote, "The answer is simple. The world is driven by diverse forces. We vividly see and feel the political, economic, and military forces daily. But there are also less visible forces, whose mode of operation is less overt. One of them is actually an idea, that all human beings are equal, and that all deserve rights because they're human beings. That idea is responsible for the greatest and most important revolutions in history. It's an idea that operates like dark matter in the universe, in silence. And it, together with those who oppose the occupation, is pushing us to end the occupation and to bring about a substantive change in the way Israeli society functions. It vests these ostensibly small and weak organizations with inexplicable might. And it will bring an end to the occupation." Thank you.
Yeah. Hi everybody, I'm Rahul Saksena I'm a staff attorney at Palestine Legal, and thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. So as Omar mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about anti-BDS legislation, and I am going to try to not be a pessimist about it. I'm going to try to be optimistic. So in Palestine Legal, just for some background, our mission is to protect and defend the civil and constitutional rights of people in the U.S. who speak out in favor of Palestinian freedom. We have 4 staff attorneys. We're kind of scattered across the country. I'm based in Chicago. I went to law school here in D.C., so I'm very happy to be back. So today I'm going to try to cover these 5 topics. If I go on and on, please just tell me to hurry up. I'll try to be relatively quick. But I want to talk a little bit about the legal background, the legal basis for the BDS movement, to put the BDS movement in the legal context. And then I want to talk about the suppression of BDS. First, by talking about the broader context of that suppression, that with the Center for Constitutional Rights, as Omar mentioned, that we covered in this report called the Palestine Exception to Free Speech. And then I want to talk about what we refer to as the 2 different waves of anti-BDS legislation. The first wave in 2014, the second wave, which we're currently experiencing, 2015 and 2016. And finally, I want to end with our legal response and also the organizing response that we've seen to these anti-BDS legislative initiatives. So is there anybody here from the Freedom to Boycott groups in Maryland or Virginia? Okay, so maybe when I get to the organizing part, I can hand it over to you to talk a little bit about what you successfully did organizing against some BDS legislative initiatives here. Okay, so first, a little bit about the First Amendment. How many people here are lawyers? I know this is DC, so probably a lot of you. Okay, so this, what is the First Amendment and why do we have the First Amendment? What is the First Amendment? Free speech. Free speech, religion, yeah. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution protects the rights to freedom of religion and freedom of speech from government interference. I'm going to focus mostly on the speech part. And why is that important? Why is the speech aspect of the First Amendment important to our society?
You can have a legitimate and equal dialogue.
Exactly, legitimate, equal dialogue, free of government censorship or suppression. Like I think about my work at Palestine Legal often in terms of not just us being an organization that supports Palestinian freedom, but also a pro-democracy organization. I think that as a democracy, we call ourselves a democracy, although that could be debatable. I think that a foundational aspect of what a democracy is the fact that we have open debate, we have open dialogue, and we're allowed to challenge each other's opinions and beliefs and viewpoints, especially on important political issues. And if we don't have that, then we don't have democracy. And a democracy thrives, a democracy is strongest when we're allowed to challenge each other's ideas, when we're allowed to have a marketplace of ideas where ideas and expression is challenged. That's kind of the foundational basis, I think, of democracy. But when one side of a debate is silenced, it hurts not just our ability to challenge our society's opinions and beliefs on that issue, it hurts democracy as a whole. And that's what we're seeing that's what we've seen when it comes to Palestine, the dialogue about Palestine in this country. And so what is speech? Speech, the Supreme Court has held the speech is not just what we say, it's not just our words, it's also our expressive conduct. So, the political statement I wear on my t-shirt, or the street theater, or the art that I have outside, or a sign that I hold, a poster that has a political statement. And in 1982, the U.S. Supreme Court held that boycotts, this country has a long tradition of boycotts, but boycotts that use legal means, not riot or revolution, I think the Supreme Court said, but legal means to bring about political, economic, and social change, to vindicate rights, are protected by the First Amendment. So the BDS movement, our right to advocate for boycotts of Israel, our right to advocate for BDS, is something that is protected by the First Amendment, and I think our Supreme Court has been very, very clear on that. So keep that in mind. So now I'm going to talk about the suppression of that right. As it's been mentioned, we worked with the Center for Constitutional Rights to release this report called the Palestine Acceptance to Free Speech, in which we documented what we see is what is actually a campaign to suppress Palestine advocacy in this country, and it happens in many forms. So when I say suppression, so in 2015, Palestine Legal, we responded to something like 240 incidents of suppression of Palestine advocacy in this country. The vast majority of that suppression happened on college campuses. I think 80% happened on college campuses because that's kind of where the BDS movement is right now the most active. But when I say suppression, what do I mean? Some of the tactics that we've seen that we documented in this report include censorship of Palestine advocacy, or even censorship of Palestine symbols. Some of you may remember the case of the GW student right on the corner here who was asked to remove his Palestine flag from his window just a few months ago, when there were clearly other flags hanging from windows. So not just censorship, but also disparate treatment. School administration after school administration after school administration is pressured by Israel advocacy groups to crack down on Palestinian advocacy treat them differently than they do other student organizing. False accusations is a big one. False accusations of anti-Semitism based exclusively on speech critical of Israel. And on the flip side, false accusations of support for terrorism based on speech supportive of Palestinian freedom. Bureaucratic barriers, school administrations setting up these hurdles that SJPs, Students for Justice in Palestine, have to go through. Seems kind of like a, maybe not a big deal, but it's actually quite nefarious. And the intent of it is to chill speech, to dissuade students from organizing Palestine-related events. Disproportionate punishment against students for Justice in Palestine, cancellation of events, and a big one that Omar alluded to is threats of meritless lawsuits. So in that context, in the context of this campaign to suppress Palestine advocacy across the country, Omar mentioned that suppression, the goal of it is to squash the debate, is to squash speech in favor of Palestinian freedom. And now we're increasingly see that suppression happening in state legislatures across the country. So this is a map of the states that just in the past few months have introduced, or in some cases passed, anti-BDS legislation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by anti-BDS legislation.
Light blue ones?
The dark blue ones. Sorry, that's a good point. It's almost 50-50.
It's interesting that there are quite a few in the north.
Yeah, quite a few in the north.
California.
Yeah. But I'll talk a little bit details about what exactly I mean by anti-BDS legislation, and I'll talk a little bit about which ones have passed and what they do. But I think it's important to remember as I'm talking about this, and this is where my optimism is going to come through. Is remember that our First Amendment protects our right to advocate for BDS. Our First Amendment protects our right to engage in boycotts. And no law, no bill, no state legislative initiative can overwrite that constitutional protection. So going back to what happened in 2014, does anybody remember in terms of anti-BDS legislation? What kind of bills were we seeing, and why?
Defunding education to punish ASA.
Exactly. So I think at the tail end of 2013, the American Studies Association passed their BDS resolution. And within weeks, we saw bills being introduced in a few states. I think it was New York, Maryland, and Illinois, seeking to punish the ASA. And they did that by threatening to defund schools or reduce funding for schools, reduce state funding for schools that housed ASA or housed an association that passed a BDS resolution. And so none of these bills passed. Why did none of them pass? Because they were clearly blatantly unconstitutional, and because there was a very strong organizing effort, including Freedom to Boycott in Maryland coalition, and including a great coalition of activists in New York that came together and fought these bills. At Palestine Legal and the Center for Constitutional Rights, National Lawyers Guild, we made the legal argument that no, sorry state lawmakers, you cannot do this. You as politicians don't have the right to threaten funding to suppress speech. That's a violation of basic First Amendment principles. So here's a quote. The New York bill, this is about the New York bill, is an ill-considered response to the American Studies Association resolution and would trample on academic freedoms and would chill speech and dissent. Where's this quote from? Any guesses? Not some left-wing legal organization or association, but our friends at the New York Times. Not exactly the Palestinian freedom fighters, but at least strong on First Amendment and academic freedom issues. So we had a good media criticism of these bills. So fast forward from 2014 to 2015, in the span of 1 year, the BDS movement started gaining quite a bit of traction, especially on college campuses. divestment resolution after divestment resolution, and also in religious institutions. And so lawmakers, Israel advocacy groups got together again and said, what can we do? These academic freedom threats didn't work. What can we do now? We can't make BDS illegal because there's this First Amendment problem. So how can we go around that? And so now what we're seeing is the proliferation of anti-BDS legislation that vary from state to state, but they all include three basic components, or at least two of these three components. The first component is a blacklist. So this is Israel advocacy organizations going to lawmakers and saying you have to blacklist these people. In some cases, it's people. In some cases, it's organizations. In some cases, it's corporations. So in New York, for example, it's all of the above. Individuals would be blacklisted. Individuals, there's no limit in the geographic scope. So somebody in a village in India who supports BDS, if the bill in New York passes, would be blacklisted by the state of New York. It's crazy. Second component is a prohibition on state contracts. So they say, okay, we can't make boycotting Israel illegal, but what if we say, if you boycott Israel, we're not going to let you do business with the state of New York or whatever state it is. And the third component is pension fund divestment. They're saying, all right, if you are a corporation and you boycott Israel, we don't want to have anything to do with you, so we're going to divest our pension fund from you. So this is lawmakers with Israel advocacy groups trying to be creative in their approach to violating the First Amendment, basically. But there are basic constitutional principles that say, you can't suppress protected speech, and you can't use government. You can't use government funding. You can't use government levers as a way to suppress that speech. And there's actually very clear Supreme Court case law from the late 90s that says very directly the government cannot punish state contractors for their political viewpoints. And so these state contracting laws in particular directly violate that very clear Supreme Court case law. So I tried to fit it all in one slide, but they didn't all fit because there's so many of them. But this is kind of like an example of what's being introduced in the states. You don't need to memorize it all right now because I'll give you a link to a website that has all the information you need. The top 5, Illinois, South Carolina, Florida, Indiana, and Arizona, have all passed and become law. Illinois was the first. It happened last year. And their law, requires the state to create a blacklist of foreign companies that boycott Israel, and requires the state pension fund to divest from those companies. And so just about a month ago, the state of Illinois finally released their blacklist of foreign companies, and it's been criticized. Illinois has actually become kind of a laughingstock in the media because on this blacklist appear companies that have said out loud, like, we have not boycotted Israel, we have no intention to do so. It also includes G4S, which is the target of BDS campaigns. And so Illinois has come under a lot of pressure and has been mocked for their blacklist. And it kind of goes to show, I think, how in a way these bills are not only ineffective, but also these things are being created behind closed doors without any transparency. These lists, and in the end, they're actually making a mockery of the state lawmakers who have been advocating for them. New York's, so far, I think is the most blatantly unconstitutional because, as I mentioned, its blacklist includes individuals. I think that's the only state that includes individuals right now, but that hasn't passed. I think one of the bills passed the state Senate, but it has not passed the Assembly. And Pennsylvania has 3 different bills pending. One of them is an academic freedom bill a la 2014. They missed that boat and didn't get the memo. I don't think that bill is going to be moving anywhere, though. So this is a quote about, I'm going to play the who said this again game. This is a quote about the California bill. The bill, AB 2844, in print raises very serious and possibly insurmountable First Amendment concerns. Any guesses on who said that?
Scalia.
No, not Scalia. It wasn't LA Times, and it wasn't, it wasn't a legal organization like Palestine Legal or CCR. It was the California Assembly Judiciary Committee Legal Analysis, which was released 2 days ago. The following day, yesterday, the committee members made minor tweaks to the bill and passed it through the committee, despite the possibly insurmountable First Amendment concerns. So this is kind of like what we're dealing with, lawmakers who don't even listen to their own legal analysts, let alone groups like Palestine Legal and CCR. Okay, so this is, I think this is the most important slide. I've said it already, but this is really all you need to know. Your right to boycott and to advocate for BDS is protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. There are all these anti-BDS bills out there, and a lot of people are talking about them, and a lot of people are concerned about them. And I actually think that the biggest threat that they pose is the chilling effect that they have. Because people say there are these anti-BDS bills, they are criminalizing us, they're taking away our right to advocate for BDS and to boycott Israel, and that's not true. Don't listen to them. They might have these contracting provisions, they might have these pension fund divestment provisions, and yes, they might have a blacklist, which is scary, and we should fight them. And our lawmakers should be held accountable. Our lawmakers should be in the business of protecting our rights and expanding our rights and defending our constitutional rights, not the other way around. But at the end of the day, I think the bottom line is we should keep in mind that none of these bills take away our right to advocate for BDS or to boycott Israel, and that's important. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what Palestine Legal and our partners at CCR and the NLG, National Lawyers Guild, are doing, and the ACLU are doing to fight these bills. At Palestine Legal, I kind of see our job as threefold, and if any of you disagree or have more advice for us, I would love to engage in a dialogue about what more we could be doing. But I think our job as a legal organization working on Palestine issues is, one, to track the bills and to provide resources to track the bills and let people know which bills are where in their state. And so we've teamed up with our partners at the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation and Jewish Voice for Peace to create a website called righttoboycott.org. And if you go to that website, you'll see this map of the U.S. You can click on the state that has anti-BDS bill. It'll take you to a page that has different resources. It lets you know where the bill is in committee or what the status of it is. Gives you a quick description of the bill and gives you a link to take action to fight the bill if there's an action available. So one, I think our job is to track these bills. Two, I think our job is to provide activists with legal resources to fight these bills, to share with their lawmakers, to let them know that these bills violate our Constitution, and to let them know as lawmakers that their job is to protect our rights, not take them away. So for many of these states, we've written legal memos or legal letters for your lawmakers. You can download them on the pages, and you can share them with your lawmaker. And finally, I think, as I hope I did today, I think our job is to let activists know, or to inform activists, not only what these bills do, but more importantly, what they don't do. As I mentioned, I think the biggest threat that the campaign to suppress Palestine advocacy has, not just in terms of anti-BDS legislation, but also what we're seeing across the country, is a chilling effect on our right to speak out. And when we feel like we don't have the right, when we're scared to speak out, when our speech is chilled, that hurts the movement, that hurts our dialogue as a democracy, and it's what's going to maintain the broken status quo on this issue. And so it's really important to keep that in mind and to not be intimidated by to not be intimidated and to not be misled by the media's messaging on these anti-boycott laws. I think that's all, but I do want to talk about the amazing organizing work that's happening. So we've teamed up. I'd love to hear from the Right to Boycott folks in Maryland or Virginia that are here. But some observations that I want to share that I've made at Palestine Legal about the organizing is that, pension fund divestment, like, yeah, it's bad. We should fight it. State contracting is blatantly unconstitutional, and we should fight it. But I think that what we should really keep in mind as we fight it, and what the coalitions that have emerged across in each states to fight these bills have done really well, is use these bills as an opportunity. Use these bills rarely does the mainstream media cover BDS, but they cover legislative initiatives, and these are an opportunity to tell our neighbors and to tell our lawmakers and to tell our communities, this is not only about our constitutional rights, but this is about BDS, and this is what BDS is. And the coalitions that have emerged in states across the country to fight these bills have done a really good job of seizing that opportunity, of placing op-eds in local papers, of writing letters to the editor to talk about BDS, and using this as the media hook. So that's one. And two, what we're seeing now in places like Maryland, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in New York, is that these bills have created networks, have created coalitions that have come together to fight them, and those coalitions outlive the bills. And those coalitions that came together to fight these bills are turning, once the bills are done, are turning and saying, oh, now we know each other, why don't we launch a BDS campaign? So in that way, strategically, I think it's important. The Israel advocacy groups behind these bills have a lot of money and have a lot of power. And how can we use that in our favor? How can we use that strategically to advance the BDS, to advance BDS? I think it's an opportunity, and so that's why I think that that's why I'm trying to be an optimist about these. And I think it's real. I think that's what's happening.
We have a question right there, yes.
Yeah, actually, I thank you for a very illuminating presentation. My name is David Schwartzman. I'm actually a member of the International Committee of the Green Party of the United States, and I was part of it when, led by Justine McCabe from Connecticut, we did put in our platform a support of BDS. And the last time Jill Stein ran, she was kind of weak on that, and we had some critique. But this time, she will be the probable candidate for president from the Green Party, and she was interviewed not too long ago and says she supports BDS, and we intend to push her in that direction. Now, I'm raising this because here is an opportunity, given the dynamics of this presidential race, and even the fact that Bernie Sanders actually moved to J Street away from AIPAC position, that this could be an opportunity to have more discussion and debate about this issue and bring BDS into this political discourse in this election. So I'd like you to respond to that, but I just have one quick comment about the South African experience. There is a part two. As we know, once majority rule was established, the white minority, particularly the corporate sector, knew that they were going to continue their domination. And unfortunately, the ANC gave up parts of its platform, like nationalizing the banks and so on, and adopted a neoliberal economic policy. So the economic status of the majority really in some ways got worse. And I'm just raising this as a possible scenario for hopefully the outcome of breaking Israeli apartheid, that this may be an element that should be considered. Thank you.
Really, really insightful questions. Thank you. I should have known, speaking in D.C., that we get a politics question around this issue. I will say, I mean, look, on a lot of these issues, mainstream politics, the executive, legislature are the last body to shift. But I think it's important to note the shifts that are happening. You, I think, very well described the shifts in the Green Party, which I think is on point. And I think we shouldn't underplay the significance of Senator Sanders' comments at Thursday night's Democratic debate. I mean, for the first Jewish candidate in U.S. history to win a delegate ahead of the New York primary, the largest concentration of the Jewish population outside of Israel, to, in that setting, speak with firm conviction about the fact that Hillary spoke at AIPAC, had no conciliatory language to Palestinians. Nothing he said is revolutionary, right? Let's not kid ourselves. But in that form, in that setting, with that applause, was significant. And I think it exactly shows the point I was making about BDS changing the calculus of actors. That conviction comes from a place of understanding that the risk that this Israeli government is going on is going to the point, and I think many would say it's now inevitable, or some will say it was inevitable from 1993, from the beginning of Oslo. You're getting to the point where the only outcome will be the end of Zionism as a governing ideology of the state of Israel. So I think it's significant, and it should be noted. And I totally agree with your characterization of it. But at the end of the day, those wheels move slowly in reaction. I think it's important to say that that comment and the movement in national politics would not have happened, period, at the end without the Palestinian Solidarity Movement here in the U.S., of which BDS is a key part of it. And without the brave work of Jewish Voice for Peace, SJP, so many other groups around the country. Very briefly on your second point, and it's so dead on, and I wish I had 3 hours or 4 hours to talk about South Africa, because I was there for a conference and I was interacting with young, mostly black lawyers there, and it's fascinating because this was the question, right? I remember my second to last night we had a dinner, and my South African colleagues, to a person, all told me, we think Mandela sold us out, which was incredible for me to have heard that. And I want to say the following, though, because I think it's important to keep in perspective. The deal that was made between the ANC and between the Afrikaner population and apartheid was a very simple one, right? We will, in essence, forego systematically changing the structures of socioeconomic power in return for political civil rights and enshrining socioeconomic rights in the Constitution, with the hope that a change in the legal framework would ultimately lead to changes in the structure of society. It was a calculus that Mandela and de Klerk made, that and others made, that the best way for South Africa to live in peace and human rights and democracy was to have this sort of transition, enfranchise black South Africans, but not redistribute wealth and power. And that ultimately would happen. Yes, South Africa today is, by many accounts, more segregated, poorer. The townships, are as, in as squalor condition, worse than under apartheid by some analyses. By the way, that's not so different than the deal that was made in this country, right, around ending enslavement and Jim Crow in the South. We haven't yet seen fundamental change in the socioeconomic status of people of color in this country. I think it's a big question for all of us to consider about this. But I think if you give any representative Palestinian leader the choice today, say equal rights, one man, one vote, we all live under the same set of laws, that we have the law of return, and the right of return, I think most would take it, and that's probably the logical choice. But let history 30 years look back and debate that question, I think, as opposed to continuing the status quo.
Rahul, do you want to make any comments?
I guess the only thing that I want to say about the presidential election is that I think that what this election has made so clear to all of us is that a lot of people in this country have opinions about a lot of issues that are outside what our political establishment promotes. And on Palestine especially, I think that Palestine is one of many issues, but I think that there's a lot more support for Palestinian rights and Palestinian freedom in this country than our democratic and Republican establishment indicate. And so when our political establishment, whether it's in the state legislatures or the federal, I know I didn't talk about anti-BDS legislation at the federal level, but when the political establishment starts to take away our rights to speak out, that doesn't change the way that we feel about the issue. So if we don't have the right to speak out, then how are we going to express our feelings? So I think it's actually going down that anti-democratic pathway can be dangerous. And so I think that it's in the interest of our country, it's in the interest of our democracy to fight these bills as strongly as we can.
Great. I'm going to first take an opportunity to read a question that came from one of our online audience members. Does BDS have the potential to inflict the economic damage required to modify Israel's behavior? Considering staunch American support for Israel, when do you predict this happening?
That's outside the scope of my expertise.
Yeah.
I mean,
if there's
Omar?
anyone in this, I think that should be a question for the whole room, because you're the activist, right?
if I knew that answer, I would be doing a different job. But look, I mean, if you know, this is, I can just give a theoretical, I think, or historical perspective, which is that you never know. I mean, that history has this thing: you keep fighting, you keep fighting, you keep fighting until it changes. Again, not to be the quote of Mandela every other line that I say, but Mandela says it always seems impossible until it's done. Right, and that's sort of the way what history teaches you. I mean, again, I will hearken to another example, and might be familiar to many in the room, is Egypt. Right, if you woke up on January 1st, 2011, and you said in 1 month or in 6 weeks, the dictator has ruled the country for 3 decades, has the support of the United States, of Israel, of the Gulf, would no longer be in power, that would have been a shock. But then 2 years later, if you had said there'd be a coup and we would step back, I mean, you never know when. But I think it's clear that as long as activists keep working, and as long as the momentum keeps building, I think it will succeed. It just when is a lot can change time. Hopefully we can all make it faster. But
Thank you. We'll go over here and then back there.
Hi, thank you guys so much for being here, and it's really great to have a discussion about BDS, because I go to so many Palestinian events and people get irritated when I ask about BDS specifically, and then it turns into a whole conversation about it. But so I have a question for each of you. Mr. Omar, you mentioned that that the Palestinian cause is shifted from the international community as opposed to the Arab world, as the responsibility of the international community as opposed to the Arab world initially. So I wanted to ask you what you feel the role of the Arab world within the BDS movement is. And Mr. Rahul, I wanted to ask you about what the Palestine Legal does for students who have been victims of the so-called Zionist mafia, I would call it. My brother actually was doing a PhD program at Concordia University in Montreal, and was kicked out of the program because he was writing pro-Palestinian. He was in a film studies department but was focusing on Palestinian film, and they kind of conspired against him to kick him out of the program. So what kind of support do you provide for students who are in that situation?
yeah, we'll keep it short because I know this looks like a lot of questions. Role of the Arab world is a very important question. I mean, what many of us who've traveled in the Arab world notice is a lot of the targets of BDS operate in the Arab world, right? Look around at G4S, look around at Caterpillar. A lot of these companies are operating in other Arab countries. It's very difficult, given the state of the Arab world today, where so many countries are facing their own struggles and really serious human rights issues and abuses. And each situation and context deserves its own activism and movements. But I think at minimum, and we're starting to see some of these efforts, there should be, the role of the Arab world is to ensure at minimum that it is adhering to the guidelines set out by Palestinian civil society and by the international community. What I sort of meant, and I won't go in a long historical tangent, is if you look at the shift, historically, after the Nakba in 48, a lot of the attention was the Arab world. It was this Arab nationalist movements in the 50s and 60s, and even in the 70s, and even you can argue in Saddam in Iraq, that one of them was going to come and liberate us. I think there's been a shift in consciousness to say that, we need the international community, and that it's going to be pressure from states, and we need the U.S. role is important in Europe, and so that's sort of what I was getting at. But I think at minimum, the Arab role should be to adhere to the BDS standards set by Palestinians.
In terms of support for students who face suppression from Israel advocacy organizations or from their own school administration. So first of all, our services are free. So if you are a student out there listening to this, or any of you in this room, or even if you're not a student, please visit our website, palestinelegal.org, and get in contact with us if you feel like your rights have been violated in terms of your Palestine advocacy. But we give legal advice to students. We represent students, or we refer students to other lawyers who can help them, given assuming we don't have if we don't have the capacity. But there's a number of legal tools we can use. We at Palestine Legal, kind of in the tradition of CCR and the National Lawyers Guild, we consider ourselves movement lawyers. So we will speak with an individual student about what suppression they're facing. We'll talk to them about a broader organizing strategy that our legal advocacy and our legal representation can supplement. But we will talk to school administrators. We will send legal letters. We will make sure administrators know their students' rights are being suppressed, and we will make sure that they understand their First Amendment rights or legal obligations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, for example. And in addition, as I mentioned, we document the suppression, and we do advocacy. We use our documentation as an advocacy tool. We go to school administrations and we say, look, this is what's happening to your students, and you have a legal obligation to make sure your students have the right to speak out on Palestine. And so, yeah, we use whatever legal tools that we have.
Hi, I'm Mark Harrison. This is a question for Omar. Have you seen any Israeli companies concerned about BDS, that they are now putting pressure on the Israeli government to end the occupation? And the role there, I've heard reports of there have been companies who have told Israeli companies, if you stay in the settlements, we will no longer do business with you. So are you aware that this activity is happening? And
So
this one, I don't know if it's true or not, is G4S the largest employer in all of Africa, private employer of all of Africa?
So it's a good. Can you repeat the second part of your first question? Are Israeli about the occupation? Israeli companies. What was that question?
There's been a discussion.
Yeah.
Corporations can play a role in making
Right.
change.
Right.
All right. And you know about the 1%. So are there any Israeli companies putting pressure on the government to end
Right.
occupation?
Right.
Because they're afraid, like the banks, has some concern now about the banks.
Right.
What Europe did.
Right. So it's a good question. Quickly on G4S, I've read a report that it's the largest employer. I can't speak authoritatively. I've only read that, so I don't know if that's true. But I think it's important to mention. A lot of companies use this argument. Well, we employ a lot of people. Palestinians will be affected, right? And sort of the retort that I often give to that is to say, well, in this country, slavery also provided shelter to some slaves, right? But sometimes there is an economic cost to changing something. So I think, and really the idea, I think, for a lot of, so in response to your question about Israeli companies, not known. It's not a very public discourse that happens in Israel around the effect of BDS. Israel now has its own Palestine exception increasingly in place in terms of literally providing sanctions for openly endorsing BDS, for talking about BDS. There's the space. The quote I read from Michael Safard is in reaction to the fact that Israeli society increasingly is closing the space to discuss this. So it's difficult to know behind closed doors what's being said, but it is well known, and that companies in general are increasingly reconsidering their actions in the occupied territories. Israeli and international companies have pulled out. Others have expressed their concern. So it's clear it's starting to take effect, but it's also important to remember the arc of history on a lot of these issues, right? South Africa, from the launch of their boycott BDS campaign, we're talking about the span of 20, 30 years, from the 50s and 60s when it was launched to the late 80s, early 90s when we saw a change. It might be longer in this context given the sort of institutional support for right-wing Israeli policies here in the United States. So to answer your question very directly, I haven't necessarily seen any of that reporting, but I also don't think it's the sort of thing that would be reported. I think it's a kind of backroom situation. I mean, the example I would think of is in North Carolina now. You do have some companies coming out with statements or pulling out, very vocally doing so. So if we haven't seen that among Israeli companies, but I would not be surprised if some companies behind doors are saying, listen, you've got to make it easier for us. Because ultimately, that's what Israel wants. It wants legitimacy. It wants its companies to be able to operate on equal footing, and its policies are very much undermining that.
Great. We'll just take 3 more questions. I'll have the 3 people answer them over there and in the front and then over here. Sorry, we just can't. We were running out of time.
Hi. So I think first off, the North Carolina thing specifically targets trans people, and it's not the entire spectrum of the queer community. So I think that's important to note. So I'm wondering why the citational choice to heavily cite and focus on Israelis and the Africana people instead of the people that are suffering from apartheid and colonization in Africa and South Africa and in Palestine. Because it seems like through your talk there's a large centering about the Israeli people and how their perspective is, and I'm just wondering what we lose if we're not actually centering like Palestine lived experience. And then I also wanted your opinion on the idea of moving forward as a rights-based framework, since it's largely failed to guarantee any type of sustained liberation in any context, especially here in the United States, and given the parallels between the United States as a colonizing force and Israel as a colonizing force, just what your thoughts are on that. And then my other question...
Can we just limit it to 2 questions, because we have a lot of other ones, please. So let's go ahead and have the person in the front ask a question. Thank you. So we're going to just take a few questions, if you don't mind, and then have you answer. Go ahead.
Hi, your discussion, your comparison of South Africa and Israel is very compelling, but how would you answer the people who say what really brought the South African government down was not BDS, it was Cuba, the Cuban troops' help in defeating the South African army, that's what really weakened South Africa, and that's what really forced them to begin dealing.
And then just one more over here.
Can I make a comment rather than ask a question? This is about the role of the Arab countries. We have to remember that actually the boycott started with the Arab countries. After 48 until Camp David, the Arab countries had a total almost boycott against Israel. And by the way, the U.S. was always trying to break that up also. And it continues to do that. So in the Arab world, really the movement is from boycott to what they call tatbi'a, normalization. It's the other way around. Here we have normalization, and more than normalization, we're trying to go to BDS. In brief, this is really the difference between the Arab world and here. My quick question is to Rahul. Now, the 2015 to 2016 legislation that you have been talking about, isn't this BDS itself by the government? Kind of you are fighting BDS with your own BDS. Is this legal? Kind of, can you do that? The government boycotting its own citizens? Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I can answer that one first, I think. So, yeah, I mean, especially with the pension fund divestment, like it's using divestment against BDS activists is what they say. But there's a key difference, I think. It's one. So for a lot of states actually right now divest their pension funds from South Sudan and Iran. That's like state policy in a lot of states. And the BDS movement would advocate for divesting pension funds, I think, from Israel or from companies that profit from the occupation. There's a very big difference, I think, an important difference between that kind of divestment versus divesting from somebody based on their speech, the fact that they boycott something. So so I think that divesting from Iran doesn't implicate anybody's First Amendment rights. It's just it's a matter of policy. It's a policy decision, I'm not taking any sides on that policy decision, but it's very different to say we're going to divest from companies because they boycott somebody.
So really good questions in the corner. So yeah, I appreciate the clarification on trans versus the rest of the movement. Although I think it's an example of the success of the LGBTQTI movement over the years that this kind of mobilization is taking place and that trans rights have been included, because that's something that's I think more recent development. I think you have great questions. The reason I didn't talk about center Palestinian voices is because BDS as a target is targeting the stronger power. You're looking at the decisions of the force that governs between the river and the sea, and that's why the narrative and the way that Israelis think about their own state and identity in the future is so relevant, because that's the state that's in power. I think generally, it's very important to lift voices in those struggling, but my presentation here was really specifically on why BDS is successful. And I think the voice of Palestinian civil society is made clear in what I mentioned, the July 2005 call by 171 Palestinian NGOs to embrace boycott, divestment, and sanctions towards the three political ends of ending the occupation, right of return rights for Palestinians within 1948. And then in terms of rights-based framework, it's another really great question. What I would say is, and this is my perspective, as Rahul mentioned, that we're movement lawyers. I am a lawyer, but I come firmly from the belief that lawyers and the law is not what changes societies. It's movements and activists. And the role of lawyers is to really support movements. An example, for example, our Professor Salaita case, somebody who is vocal and active gets fired from a job, and when asked to play a role to support that movement. When I say a rights-based framework, what I mean is the discourse, right? The discourse is shifting from one of, I want my state, I want my flag, I want my, because now you have an authority that has a flag and that has missions and that has status in the UN, but the lives of Palestinians, I was today speaking on a panel with the heads of two of the largest Palestinian human rights organizations, and our colleague from Gaza said the situation today is the worst he's ever seen in Gaza today, right? So those things haven't changed the reality on the ground, which is why you see, I think, Palestinian movement moving towards a framework that centers on rights as opposed to a national framework. It's not denying Palestinian nationhood, but it's rather a political framing and rhetoric that's different. And very briefly on the question about Cuba, I think I'm not an historian, nor am I someone that can claim to have extensive expertise in South Africa. I've read about it. I was in very interesting exchanges recently, but I don't think that's the right reading of history. I think if you read the words of both Afrikaners as well as Black South Africans, I think they will talk about their movement, their organizing, and the solidarity of international communities. People forget that, the diamond industry was significant in South Africa. The Reagan administration in the 1980s had very close ties to South Africa. The ANC was a terrorist organization as designated by the United States. It's not the extent of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, but there was a very important buttress that South Africa, the apartheid regime, had from the international community. And breaking that, and a lot of it grew out of the civil rights movement in this country, was critical to shifting the calculus of South African leaders and allowing, ultimately, for the end of apartheid.
Great. Rahul, do you have anything to say more? Or Omar, any closing remarks?
Thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Rahul and Omar, for providing us with this incredible amount of information and elucidating a lot of the topics and conundrums in this whole thing, and also just reminding us of the principles behind BDS and the rights that we're all working for. It's nice to see two lawyers who are working in organizations at the forefront of this work, and we really appreciate what you do. Thank you, and thank you all for your wonderful questions.